The event we saw that claimed the life of Lorenzo's brother Giuliano, as well as nearly his own, would come to be known in the history books as the Pazzi conspiracy. And though, once again, the game does a nice job of covering this overall, it of course misses some details, and in others it glazes over some of the real causes of this firestorm, and the aftermath was a completely different story from what we will see in the future. These were done largely in order to, as you can imagine, stitch the happenings in the game and develop a lengthier plot. But I think it deserves some special attention. Before I get into this, bear in mind that the game takes liberties, of course, as you'd expect from, as seeing from the first one what happened with the deaths, the dates and what have you, and for the most part, what I touch on here is going to be very different from what we see in-game. The villains for the most part are real people, and when I say this person died this year from this, take that with a grain of salt versus what we see in-game. It shouldn't come as a spoiler that those people are gonna die. I mean, they killed Ezio's father, and they're all the typical mustache-twirling baddies, and we're playing an assassin. The end result should be, clear as day. The when, how, and why of how they died differs versus history. To touch on what was addressed previously, the Pazzi was a powerful family of bankers and merchants, but they were always playing second fiddle to the Medici. In the months prior to the attempted assassination, a trio at the head of the conspiracy met several times to iron things out. Firstly, you had Francesco de Pazzi, a powerful merchant in the area. Secondly was Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa. Thirdly was a mercenary who worked for the church, or what was known as a condottiere. This merc went by the name of Gian Battista Montesecco. Pazzi and Salviati were already in agreement and had settled things regarding the plot on a financial and basic logistic level. They brought in Montesecco later on because they needed muscle and, more manpower to pull this off. The plan was to assassinate the two Medici brothers when they visited the Pope in Rome for Easter. Montesecco showed hesitation since he was rather faithful to the Pope and Count Girolamo Riario, both of whom he served. He'd basically be breaking off from them to do some wet work, which would potentially upset or rub off on his employers. Salviati and Pazzi met with him again in the near future, telling him that Count Riario and Pope Sixtus IV, his bosses, supported this assassination. This still seemed pretty off to Montesecco, who was, very wisely, very hesitant about this. The political repercussions from this would be insane, and he wanted full assurance that this was legitimately from the Pope and from the Count, and it was what they wanted. So, a third meeting was arranged. Montesecco this time met directly with Pope Sixtus IV in person. He pressed the Pope on whether or not the Medici should be killed, to which Sixtus responded that he didn't specifically ask for murder. He simply wanted a change in the government. Francesco de Pazzi then interjected and asked if they had freedom to pursue whatever means necessary to get this done. The Pope said yes, they had complete free reign. Even though he did not directly say it, Sixtus had personally given them the green light on assassinating the Medici brothers. And this was when the gears started springing into action. Now, though their family was attached to this, the Pazzi weren't the only folks with personal interests vested in the outcome of this. The larger question comes up first, I suppose. Why the heck did the church want the Medici dead? Well, as you can imagine, politics was heavily involved, meaning lots of chest beating, pissing contests, and backstabbing. The Pope at the time was Sixtus IV, and would have a particularly famous chapel named after him a few decades after he passed away. It had some
random guy who decided to paint on the ceiling or something like that, but, you know, whatever. Sixtus claimed the papacy in 1471, and as was the trend of the time, he was a very corrupt pope. Albeit not the worst pope on several fronts, he would be known for his nepotism, or basically abusing his power to further his relatives and close friends. The gist of it was, if a cushy position opened up somewhere, he'd yank a relative, of which he had many, to occupy it. The previously mentioned Count Girolamo Riario was in the process of amassing lands for a principality, and being one of Sixtus's many nephews, got a helping hand from his uncle Sis. Additionally, Sixtus wanted to make a land grab and claim some papal territories alongside Tuscany. When it came to Sixtus bidding on a certain town in particular known as Imola, he butted heads with Lorenzo, who was vying to absorb it into his territories. The bid continuously rose, leading to Sixtus setting out to top Lorenzo's bid by borrowing money from a bank in the region. The thing is, Lorenzo held so much clout that he effectively cut off the Pope entirely from receiving a loan to top off the bid. However, in spite of this solid display of opposing the Pope, one family broke off and gave Sixtus the money, the Pazzi. Of course, this did not settle well with Lorenzo. Let's cover our other conspirators, though, before we get started on some of the more nitty-gritty details. Why was Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa of all people, involved in this? Well, Salviati wasn't from a posh family like the Medici or the Pazzi, and he had his eyes set high on rising within the church. In 1472, the position of Archbishop of Florence as a whole freed itself. Even though he was supposedly an ideal candidate, Lorenzo stepped in and gave the title to his brother-in-law. He was never really close to the Medici, so Lorenzo had no qualms with cutting in line past him. Though a bit rude as well as abusive, this was actually within Lorenzo's unofficial powers, and whenever this was done, the church would usually back away and let matters lie. But Salviati marched over to Pope Sixtus and demanded some action be taken. Sixtus decided to make him the Archbishop of Pisa as a sort of sorry, thanks for trying sort of prize, also to hopefully shut him up. However, this was a touchy issue. Pisa had just been absorbed into Florence, and was lacking in an archbishop temporarily while things got smoothed out on the red tape front. So the Pope overtly stepped past Lorenzo, the unofficial ruler, his politicians as well, far overstepping what Florence viewed the Pope capable of doing. Lorenzo was so angry that he shut off Pisa from Salviati, not allowing him to enter and perform his duties. This wasn't a small spat either. He had to wait in Rome for nearly 3 years before he was finally allowed into Pisa. Past that, the conspirators had 2 other major supporters. First was a fellow by the name of King Ferrante of Naples. He quite literally fought his way to the throne and could be seen, he could be seen as the epitome of a politician and opportunist. I mean, constant poker face, a tried and true snake in the grass. He wanted to expand northward in his territories, but Florence was kind of sitting on some attractive territories he wanted. This wasn't a personal drag-out grudge he had against Lorenzo, unlike everybody else involved in this. He merely saw Lorenzo as some guy that had some stuff he wanted. Now bear that process in mind, and we'll come back to that later on. The final major ally of the conspiracy was Federico da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino. He was another condottiere, much like Montesecco, and was hired to bring in even more bodies to ensure that it goes smoothly. Now that we've got most of the major actors on stage here, let's backtrack to Lorenzo and Sixtus butting heads over the bid of Imola. In 1474, following the cold treatment by the Medici and their allies surrounding the bid for Imola, the Pope was determined to hold a grudge. Firstly, he removed himself and his allies, or at least as best he could, from doing business with the Medici. Hoping to do further harm to his coffers, the papacy began wrapping the lingering Medici accounts up in red tape, however they could. I mean, for example, the Medici accounts had ties to some alum mines that were controlled by the papacy. So these accounts that they were tied into, they were audited repeatedly, and whenever they were under an audit, the transferring would get lagged consistently. It was a real big pain in the ass, and he did stuff like this as best he could to basically harass and annoy Lorenzo. Of course, the Pazzi weren't being forgotten here. Lorenzo recognized how the Pazzi openly were flipping him the bird when they stepped in to assist the Pope, even though he told everybody not to. Now, what he did in turn, well, around this time, this was 1476, 1477, a family member of the Pazzi named Giovanni married a lady named Beatrice Borromeo. As was the theme of the time, it was a marriage of convenience, particularly because Beatrice was the daughter of an incredibly wealthy family that had no sons. I mean, we were talking seriously loaded here. This was a big golden egg for the Pazzi, and they were pleased with the idea of her marrying into the family so they could basically, make use of all the money she was tied to. Now, with this in mind, Lorenzo decided he'd get a bit of revenge for the Pazzi sneaking behind his back. So with this, he passed a law stating that it would be illegal for a daughter to receive the family inheritance if she had no brothers. It was kind of an odd, yet precise law geared strictly toward this marriage in particular. As a result, the highly touted marriage of convenience suddenly became rather inconvenient, as Giovanni's new bride wasn't worth much to him monetarily. Of course, the Pazzi, they were a family of bankers and merchants, as I mentioned before, and if you fuck with their money, well, that's some serious stuff right there. So this was when things began to take a serious run toward the idea of assassination. The previously mentioned trio gathered around this time, and they finally devised their plan. It was pretty straightforward, yet had potential unforeseen consequences. At first, the Pazzi were very cautious in their approach. They were going to kill Lorenzo and his younger brother on Easter, when the Medici brothers were going to visit Rome for the various festivities. Rome was perfect for several reasons, chief of which they were uncertain how the city would react to the sudden replacement of the ruling families. The Pazzi would need to gut the Medici in place laws and empty out the entire infrastructure of elected officials so they could get everything squared away and on their side. I mean, Florence was Medici's home turf, and killing them in the lion's den, though gutsy, could turn ugly, what with most of the movers and shakers firmly anchored in the Medici pockets. As things approached Easter, however, the Medici had a change of plans. They decided to stay put and not visit Rome for Easter. This could have been due to the politics of the time or just for a number of reasons. The bottom line is that the plan suddenly fell through. They needed a new location, but they were uneasy about doing it in Florence still. So they approached Sixtus, who was known prior to his role of pope as Francesco della Rovere, with a new plan. The Medici brothers and family were invited to attend a banquet at a certain della Rovere estate, taking them out of Florence and putting them back into the Pope's home turf. They'd kill them there, and it'd be simple. This was just a momentary kink in their plan, no biggie at all. They could work around this. So, April 19th, 1478, the date of the plot arrived. Lorenzo arrived at the banquet, but, there was a snag. Giuliano wasn't with him. He evidently hurt his leg and decided to stay behind. Lorenzo may have been the mastermind of the family, but Giuliano, albeit younger than Lorenzo, was said to take after his brother in more ways than one, and some sources of history say that he was possibly smarter, more even-tempered, and a number of things. Basically, he was not someone you could brush off, was the bottom line. if they got rid of one of the brothers, the other would still be around, and they were both pretty on the level. Bottom line, Giuliano was a dangerous loose end. They'd have to take out both the brothers in one fell swoop. And so the awkward banquet continued. By this point, Salviati, the maligned Archbishop of Pisa, had been allowed into his office by Lorenzo. The previous scuffle that locked him out of Pisa had been over for a few years. So Salviati spoke with Lorenzo at length on the topic of, just some idle banter. How's the weather? How's that sort of stuff, And thinking on his feet quickly, he was quick to change the conversation toward a new plot. He asked if he could visit Florence in a week on Easter so he could view some of the newer, highly touted artwork of the era. Hey, they could also attend Easter Mass together. I mean, they were buddies now, right? Seemed like an innocent request, since Lorenzo had no real reason to think that assassination was even on the table at such a setting. I mean, he knew these guys hated him, but wanted to kill him? Well, who could say how much foresight he had on this topic? Anyways, a week later, things were set in motion, and they could not be stopped at this point. Since this was in Florence, or rather enemy territory, special changes had to be made to the plan. Nearly 100 men came into Florence with Salviati, which could be seen as a generous, albeit not insane, entourage of bodyguards for him to be traveling with. However, outside of the city, two sizable armies were sneaking through Tuscany. Both of these were led by Montesecco, the condottiere's immediate subordinates. The meeting place chosen was the Duomo in Florence at Easter Mass. All the figures gathered outside the cathedral, and all was set. Lorenzo was there, and so what? No. Giuliano was actually feeling sick, and he stayed behind. Well, this was getting awkward and also kind of suspicious and a little bit old. There was no backing down at this point, since Montesecco's forces were closing in on Florence, and they would have definitely been spotted, if not by now, by the time a runner would reach them. I mean, there was no way to tap the brakes on this. Things were going to happen, and they had to happen as planned. Now, it's a little thin on the information, but somebody apparently nagged Lorenzo enough to the point where he sent someone to fetch Giuliano. When Giuliano arrived, the conspirators, suspicious for good reason, they needed to test whether this was coincidence or if he was already onto their plot. So Francesco de Pazzi came over and came to Giuliano and gave him a big old bro hug. But he was more concerned with testing his target, seeing if he was armored, using the hug as kind of an excuse to pseudo-frisk him. He didn't feel any armor. So, everything was in place. Nothing seemed to be suspected. Francesco de Pazzi spread word around as everyone entered the church. Things are going to proceed as planned.